All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Andrew Stuttaford, an editor at legendary conservative Journal of Opinion National Review, where he manages finance and investing news in their Capital Matters section, as well as a fellow at the National Review Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Andrew.
It's great to be here, Richard. Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Now, just so that people understand your own background and your sort of approach to these issues in this world of finance and investing, can you give listeners just a really quick description of your career and how you ended up as a journalist now and editor at National Review?
Absolutely. I'll do this very quickly. As your more astute listeners might be aware, that I'm not actually from the US. Was born in the UK, qualified as a lawyer there, and worked in finance over there, equity finance. But always was interested in the US. Started coming and going. Took second best, which was a job in Toronto, which was actually a great job, a lovely time there, and then moved to the US in 1991, and where I worked basically in international equity finance for the next, well, from 1991 until 2020, specializing in dealing in the equities, primarily the equities of Nordic companies. Contrary to the perception of the Nordic world amongst the American left, there's actually quite a lively ecosystem of companies over there, and they are much more free market countries than people think. I've always been political and an interest in politics, and have always been, shall we say, on the free market, right? Huge areas of agreement with CEI, and but when I came here, I knew as an old family friend, John O'Sullivan, who was then the editor of National Review. And we sort of met up simply by chance of the street, actually, and then, sort of resumed the acquaintance. And then one day he said, well, we need an article on Russia. And I was going to Russia in a couple of weeks, and I told him that. And I said, could I do it? And if you hate it, just tear it up, and I'll never ask you again. And that's how I got into journalism. So and then with the opening up of the internet to journalism and National Review online, no one really wanted to write for internet. So who reads that? Who reads that? And I'd submitted some piece, and Rich Lowry, who was by then the editor, said, "Oh, give it to online." I was a little bit disappointed, but there we were. And then it ran, and Catherine Lopez, Kalos, said to me, "Do you want to do more for us?" "Yeah, sure," I said. I said, "What on?" "Anything you want." And so I freelanced on the side, first for National Review, then for other publications for many, many years. And then in 2020, my financial career was at a break point. And the firm that I was working for decided that it wanted to leave the US. And I had to take one course or the other. And then National Review and I were, we were close, and they wanted to set up this thing called Capital Matters. And our concern was that free markets were under attack, as you know, at CEI very, very well, from both, not only from the left, the old villains, but also from the corporate sector with ESG, which I had come across in my professional life and had been disgusted by, I have to say, from the moment I saw it. But also increasingly the political right. And so the idea of Capital Matters is that we would defend free markets against all comers, basically. And I was asked very kindly, would I edit it? And I agreed to. And then, so these days, it's me and Dominic Pino, who is absolutely terrific, and I think has been on this show.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and he's the hard-faced Manchester liberal. He's much tougher than I am on these sort of things. He thinks I'm too influenced by markets, and so it's really Dominic and myself, obviously with the support, major support from NRI and the National Review infrastructure, and then we have Kevin Hassett, who is our sort of economic advisor and explains to us, what's going on and all the rest of it. So that's what we do.
Oh, very
Um,
nice. So, we have several big topics I know our viewers and listeners are going to be interested in. And so I'd like to get your take on what, one, just sort of the facts and the lay of the land is, but also how you think these issues are being perceived. Because sometimes, we discussed this, I think in episode 76 with Joey Politano, one of my favorite econ bloggers, Substackers, that
yep.
the data can sometimes point in one general direction, but public opinion or the vibes, as we call it these days, can be trending in the opposite direction. Uh, so the first of these big things is green and renewable energy, and what people call climate tech or green tech. There's a lot of companies that are making storage batteries for electric cars, charging stations, green energy infrastructure, and all that sort of stuff. That have raised a lot of capital and have got a lot of like potentially interesting things going on. But uh, we're also seeing this, the past couple of years, this huge surge in uh, direct subsidy from the federal government with like the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've billions upon billions trending towards the direction of trillions now. So, uh, do we think the market moves, which is startups, increasing investment from incumbent energy companies, are those mostly chasing subsidies, or is there a real stable long-term demand behind all this stuff?
Ah, I'll give you the traditional answer. That's a good question. Uh, yes, I think that there is demand, but I think that it is horribly distorted by both the carrot and stick coming from government. I mean, there are a lot of internal inconsistencies. We're told that electric vehicles are absolutely marvelous, and in fact, they're so marvelous that we'll pay you money, or we'll give you a lot of money if you buy one. And there's such an exciting business opportunity for manufacturers that we'll pay them a lot of money to build factories. And that's not the way that Henry Ford operated. Um, one one of the things I think that the problems that we have, I mean, you can take your own view on climate change. I do believe that we live in a changing climate. I do not think it's an existential threat, but I think that to the extent that we can move to better technologies, why not? If there's a good return, and return does include dangers averted. But also, I think that there are certain areas of expenditure anyway that can be done helpfully, which would return, like with the weather. Just talk about the weather. I think whatever you think about climate change, you can make arguments for saying we should be doing more to protect low-lying cities. I mean, I live in Manhattan, and not too far from the Hudson River. And although I looked at flood maps quite carefully before we bought our apartment, but mankind has tended to congregate by the coast. Well, we're going to have to build walls, and the economics of building walls are actually pretty good. So I think that the process has got horribly distorted, because the first thing that one has to understand is that there are, and I have seen, I've been around long enough to see many stock market booms, and there was an enormous and busts. And of course, the dot-com one was perhaps the most striking of my financial career. And but there was a green boom a couple of years ago, supplemented by ESG. A lot of talk. The financial press these days tends to be green and left-wing, with the Wall Street Journal as a notable exception. And things were bidded up to extraordinary levels, or bid up, and perhaps you had the formation of these, without being too technical, these SPACs, known as blank check companies, which was a way to float a new company much more cheaply than normal. And they were a product of the the whole idea of SPACs was really the product of an overheated market, which was a product of distortions of the price of money that came about through the ultra low interest rates of the 2010s, which I think was a financial disaster whose implications are yet fully to be appreciated and felt. So you had a speculative vehicle, a SPAC, and then you threw into it the most speculative of all the green sectors, which was the car sector. And so you had SPACs for electric vehicles, and most of them have done very, very poorly. And if I think that I think it's okay occasionally. I'm not a market fundamentalist, as the phrase goes. A gentle finger on the scales is absolutely fine. But what we have seen is a massively distorted market. And you have seen auto companies invest vast sums in a technology for which is clearly not ready for prime time, and which certainly has a niche, and it's certainly promising. But the numbers, as we're seeing more and more, simply do not add up. So I think we're going to have a very rough time in the auto sector. They've also managed to create the EV world, an opening for the Chinese in a global industrial sector of considerable importance. But you go everywhere, and what you're seeing, look at wind turbines. I've been following wind turbines for 30 or 40 years. The leading company for many, many years was called Vestas, and it's still called Vestas. And so I've looked at this sector for a long time. They don't really work. I mean, they work, of course they work, and they're much more efficient than they were. But in the end, they suffer from all sorts of disasters. Not disasters, inefficiencies, not disasters, inefficiencies. And the problem is you are seeing a distortion of the capital allocation. Capital should follow return. The expectations of return could be wrong, thus bubbles. But there should be, I think this is going to make me X, this is worth my while investing. And really what happened is that people have been pressed into buying or installing technologies which aren't ready for prime time. And all this money is going into so-called green sectors, when in fact, it would be much better spent by letting the market do what the market does, give a little bit of encouragement to this, a little bit of encouragement to that, and concentrate more, if we're looking at climate adaptation, which is what our species has been doing for about 250,000 years, so we're actually quite good at it. And one of the lessons that we have learned over the last 250,000 years, and most notably the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, is that affluence enables us to deal with the state of nature. And the state of nature, whatever you think of the climate, is hostile. Nature is not our friend. Even Pliny, back in Pliny the Elder, back in ancient Rome, said, "Good God," he said, if nature is our mother, it's more like a wicked stepmother. And the way we have been dealing with it, Amsterdam is below sea level and has been wealthy since the 17th century. The Dutch actually drained the part of England that I'm from, which is also at sea level or close to it. They do not have a problem with flooding, whereas Bangladesh, although in fact a country now which is making great strides, does. So the way we deal with the climate is let capital flow naturally, let's get richer, and let's use that wealth, some of it, to helping us cope with the changing climate. That is the efficient way to do it. And I know I'm ranting on here, but when you're setting policy, you must accept trade-offs. And unfortunately, fundamentalists don't do that. And you need to be asking, well, should I invest $5 million, or should we be investing $5 million or $10 million? Because the taxpayer is often involved in a set of wind turbines. Or would it be better that that money actually being used to improve water sanitation in some parts of Africa, where it makes a phenomenal
Right.
difference.
Yeah,
And Bjorn Lomborg, as you know, fights the fight for this.
yeah, and so the that's actually an angle of this that I think sort of gets left out. A lot of times the question is, oh, should we, whoever we might be, either whether it's private investment or taxpayer-funded investment, should we do this or not do that? Well, we can do some of lots of things, right?
Hmm.
It's not a matter of investing in renewable energy or not investing in renewable energy. The question is, at what marginal point does it become less smart to keep investing in any certain area? And I you know when so I sort of premise this saying like, well, are we in a subsidy driven bubble when it comes to like green tech stuff? I think some people would you know respond to that, oh no, you don't understand, green tech is a real thing, and it's renewable energy is here to stay, and it's of course it's worth investing in. But like I said, it's nothing is worth investing an infinite amount of money in. The question is how much. And any industry, any technology, any new thematic investment opportunity can be overinvested in, can turn into a bubble, no matter how much value is there, right? You could say, oh, well, there's $10 trillion of value in this market sector. Well, okay, but if you have $20 trillion of capital flowing into it, then it's still sort of bubble driven. Like I use this example about railroads. So in the
Yeah.
19th century, railroads were the most important industrial technology in the world, and they increased efficiency in lots of different ways, and contributed to the betterment of human standard of living. But there were still recurrent in the U.S. and in the U.K. and sort of starting in the first half of the 19th century, and definitely more than one railroad investment-driven bubble in the second half of the 20th century in the United States. Even the biggest, most important thing still got overinvested in, right? So if we say there's too much froth, there's an investment bubble, it doesn't mean that the underlying thing isn't of any value at all. It just means that anything can be blown up.
Totally. And it's good. I was actually just going to mention the railways myself. Because it is the classic example. There was a ferocious bubble. I'm sorry, too familiar what happened in the US, but I do know in the UK it was a astounding bubble, and lots of people lost lots of money. But at the end of the day, you had a railway system. And one of the processes of human progress has been investing in innovation, making life better. Now, sometimes they don't work, but sometimes the original investors don't make the money. It's the second or third generation of people. But the railways are there. The bits of metal are across the land. What we see with quite a lot of green investments is the money is going into stuff which is essentially just glorified repair work. We have a power system that works perfectly well. The only question now is whether we can somehow reproduce what we already have at a cost of trillions. And by the way, Janet Yellen was talking either Friday or the weekend, the global cost of green-related investments she thought would be needed between, I think the implication was 2050, which, as you know, is the big date, was $3 trillion a year, which is sort of quite a lot of money. And you would like to think you were getting something better. But if instead all we're doing is buying an insurance policy, well, let's be honest about it and price it accordingly. The other thing about investment is when you always have to think of the person buying a share or a bond, he or she is going into the restaurant and looking at the menu. If you choose X to eat, you're not going to choose Y unless you're exceptionally greedy and rather rich. And so basically all investment is a choice. And one of the great lessons I got in my career was, funnily enough, it involved a drilling company, an oil drilling company off north. I said I worked for Scandinavians. This was a good the Norwegians are very, very good at offshore drilling in deep waters. and it was a drilling company, and this was before mobile phones, which makes me sound 100, well, before day-to-day use. My boss, who probably will watch this one of these days, we asked him, could my colleague, there were three of us, and we asked him, hey, could we have one of these mobile phones? He said, mobile phones? What do you need those for? You've got quarters. And I tease about that. So I was taking a company round, and there was no mobile phones. I didn't know what the day. And this particular client who I saw at the end of the day, he had invested in one of these drilling companies. He had made a lot of money out of the investment. It had gone very well. But when I came in, the receptionist said, "Oh, he wants to have a quick word." I walk in. He's a very, very nice man, but his eyes were sort of slit, anger. God, have you seen the nose? I said, "No, I've been out with the other company." Oh, he said, "No, you wouldn't have done." Oh, well, this company came out, which the X company, it came out with a profit warning. I said, "Oh God, how much?" He told me, and I said, "How much is the stock off?" And I said, "Well, 10%." He said 10%. And I said, "Okay, well, that's not great, but you're still up, 25 or 30%. So it's not the end of the world." And he said, "Andrew, that's not how I see it. Every day when I come into work, I in a sense start from scratch. Is this the best place I have put my money, or my client's money more accurately, or should I be shifting it around?" And he said it's a perpetual process of choice and selection. And so I think, are both admirers of the French economist Bastiat.
Mhm.
And he had the parable of the broken window. And a child breaks a window, the damage is 6 francs to repair. And he says, well, your first reaction is to say, well, that's a shame, but that 6 francs has gone into the economy. The glazier has made a bit of money. And he described that as that which is seen. But then he said there is that which is not seen, which is where else could that 6 francs have been put to work more productively? And I think that with the green tech, we always have to be asking, unless we say that we take the existential thing, which is no price is too high to pay, which is not what I believe, but if you believe that, there's a logic there. You always have to ask, is this the best use of this dollar? Or could I be putting the money elsewhere to earn a better return? Or if I'm looking at philanthropic or good of society investment, do more good? And I think that process with climate-related investments has got completely screwed up.
Well, here's another kind of parallel question and issue. So the stuff that's specifically climate and environmental themed, but we also have high tech manufacturing, which is a
Yep.
big issue. And so, and just like the Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of federal subsidies for green technologies, the Chips and Science Act a couple of years
Yes.
ago has a lot of subsidies for high tech, specifically, high advanced microchip manufacturing. So the question again is, you know, how much are those subsidies distorting rather than driving in a good way, investment? Because I've seen charts for months, especially people who like to present the current White House administration as having a good, sensible economic policy, where they will show the investment in manufacturing, sort of like manufacturing, construction, new facilities. Uh, there's sort of a squiggly line in real dollar terms for the past 20 years, how much corporate America is investing in manufacturing construction. And so it goes up and then it goes down during the Great Recession, then goes up a little more, and then it falls a little and goes up, and it falls a little during COVID. And it's on a sort of very mild upward trajectory. And then the past couple years, it's almost vertical. It really shoots up during the time the IRA and the Chips and Science Act have been in force. Uh, so and then that has been used as an example of saying, see, our American economy is doing great. Manufacturing is doing great. One of the things that people are most concerned about, right? But if all of that is based on taxpayer subsidies, and certainly at the very least a large percentage of it is that sustainable?
No. No, well, is it sustainable? Yeah. I mean, stupidity. I mean, how long did the Soviet Union last? 1917 to 19, well, it wasn't called the Soviet Union originally, but let's say 1917 to 1991. I mean, we have a great, this is a very rich country, and we could remain stupid for a very long time, but we can also be underperforming for a very, very long time. I mean, Russia, people always say, well, look at all the things, the planning. Stalin turned the Soviet Union into an industrial giant. Now, it was a 50th-rate industrial giant, but he did. What no one ever says, if you never had the communist revolution, Russia in the early 20th century was on an amazing growth trajectory. It would have been far, far richer if, however, imperfect the Tsarist system was, and it was evolving. You always have to be thinking of the alternative. Going to the CHIPS Act, if you see a vertical graph on any curve, looking in the investment world, your first reaction should not be cheers, but a raised eyebrow. And a wise man was once talking to him about a Danish bank and stock, and it was a well-run company. And I said, why don't you look at him? And he said, no. Its assets have grown too quickly. And that always means trouble. And he turned out to be right. So when I see a graph, and I know exactly the graph you're referring to, it's been going around on Twitter. Something tells, when I see that sort of graph, I think this is money that is not being spent wisely. If you look, some of it be spent very, very wisely, but a lot of it will not be. I think that the issue here we have with chips is that there are two separate issues which have got muddled up. The first is, and you may, which I don't know, you may not agree with me with this, but I'm with Adam Smith, which is that he said we sometimes invest in certain industries, even though it is economically inefficient for us to do so, because it is strategically necessary for us to do so. And he was essentially directly or indirectly talking about military when he meant strategically. And I'm very suspicious of China, to put it mildly. I don't think I think the world, America, the West was naive by letting it into the WTO. It should not have happened. And I think that different rules apply. So I can see an argument, even though it is not economically efficient, for developing or redeveloping certain sectors of our economy that we could not do without. And at COVID, we got some lessons on that. We should be asking ourselves the question as to why we were unable to compete effectively and whether that can be sorted out. And when I look at chips, I don't see that question being asked. And secondly, I wrote a piece once about not loading the pack mule, which was a quote from somebody. Because if you say, okay, we want to invest in a domestic chip manufacturing fabs, and there'll be these subsidies to make it attractive and so on and so forth, and a strategic necessity to do so, then that's what you do, and that's all you do. What you don't do is load on huge amounts of social engineering onto the project. You don't stipulate that everything has to be unionized. You don't stipulate that I mean, I've nothing against union if people do it voluntarily and so on. You don't stipulate that the stuff about who you hire, educate local available education staff, and say it's not a social program. This is a defense project. It is not a social project. And if you muddle the two, you're going to get a mess. And there are clear signs that that's happening. And it is also absolutely typical of industrial policy, if we take a step on from that, is industrial policy ceases to be about economic logic or even strategic logic, but comes about carving up a pie. And so the rewards, it's, if you look at the late 19th century, a lot of politics was deciding which industries got which tariff protection, and that was nonsense. And then also, when you look at that graph, that Twitter graph, you also need to be thinking, and you were implicitly asking this question: is okay, that line is going up very, very sharp. And by the way, US manufacturing is at an all-time high and was at an all-time high before
Even
the
before the
buy.
stimulus.
Well, yeah, before the stimulus. The problem that we have is it needs far fewer people to make stuff than we did. There's this thing called automation. But if you look at the actual output, go to the, I know you would go to the St. Louis Fed, and you can see industrial production. The graph couldn't be clearer. But again, you have to ask yourself, well, the line that this is going at, if we're talking about this as an investment for private individuals, could that money be better invested in something else? Could another graph be moving up sharply? And I suspect there's going to be a lot of disappointed people in the end. And I also suspect that, what was it? If you sleep, it was the 16th century, John Florio, 16th century. If you sleep with dogs, you'll rise with fleas. Once you get into bed with government and subsidies, you essentially become you're playing a very different game. So going back to the car companies, they're investing all these billions in EV manufacturing, manufacturing cars for which there is at the moment no demand. But there's going to be all sorts of issues that arise out of that. And they are really becoming an arm of the corporatist state. And I think, and people don't understand the word corporatist because they think it sounds like corporation, which actually is the derivation, but we don't have to go into that. They always talk about big companies. It's not what it means at all. What it means is a setup whereby in effect, companies are working hand in hand with government. And the priorities shift with the government's wishes. Shareholders go to the bottom of the pile. Those are the people who really care about economic return, and economic return is how you get growth. And so I suspect that what you're seeing with a lot of this chips stuff, a lot of this building, is money is being sucked away from places that it could be more productively invested, and it's being put into vehicles, into investments with completely confused motives. As I said, if you want to say we want factory X because we don't want Z to have a monopoly on it, that's absolutely fine. You accept subpar returns. Everyone understands that. Government subsidizes it. That's great. We do a lot with the government, pays for a lot of defense. No reason why it shouldn't help out with that. I have no problem with that. But if
So
you
yeah,
pretend that it is a normal commercial investment, you're going to be disappointed.
well, yeah, we didn't expect a 10% return on the Manhattan Project because
No,
that's not what it was not what it was about. Um, but we have, like you said, we have this sort of kind of implied premise with all this investments going into the Chips and Science Act, where it's the Manhattan Project, but it's also a tech startup, but it's also the development of mature manufacturing, but it's also a way to get more women in the high tech workforce, but it's also a way to get more working women guaranteed daycare at their place of employment. And so
yeah,
you end up with what, I've used this phrase that Ezra Klein came up with in the New York Times a couple of years ago: everything bagel liberalism. Like you said, it's the similar metaphor to overloading the pack horse, right? Where we have this big major policy that's supposed to, ostensibly supposed to be accomplishing one big major policy goal, but instead it becomes a sort of Christmas tree for every interest group in America. And as a result, it doesn't, you know, you're not going to get the output that you're hoping for. Like you said, the chart, we got inputs, right? But whether we're going to get the substantive outputs that we hope for is a little more questionable.
And I could show you graphs. I couldn't actually, but I could find them somewhere. Graphs in the Soviet period. I'm not by any means directly saying that we are the Soviet Union part two. I don't believe that thesis. But you can see that the value of the inputs that goes into the factory was actually higher than the value of the outputs. That's an extreme case. But I think that what you are seeing is I just in my more than my gut, I feel that we are seeing a massive misallocation of capital because of all these muddled motives, basically.
So if we're seeing what we think is going to be a drag on growth because of misallocation of capital, the question is like, where can we hopefully see positive effects on growth? If we're talking about where finance meets politics. So the two big kind of macroeconomic unknowns, going forward, that I think a lot of Americans are looking at, and wondering where they're going to be in the next year are taxes and interest rates, right? So we've got provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax bill, that are going to be expiring. There's going to be a big debate over which ones to extend or not to extend. So that's leaving a lot of uncertainty. Although the corporate tax cut, the specific corporate income tax rate cut from 2017 is permanent. I mean, it could always
Yes.
be changed yet again, of course, but it's not one of the ones that's going to be expiring.
Well, Biden wants to increase it. I think Biden wants to increase it, as I recall.
Yes, but at least as for there's obviously tax cuts or tax rates can change anytime Congress wants to change them, but they're going some of them, including the personal income tax rates, are going to expire on their own if they're not renewed. But at least for now, the corporate rate cut is scheduled to keep rolling on. And then with the Federal Reserve and interest rates, so we've seen inflation come down significantly from the highs in 2022, and so a lot of people. There's a better than me. Everyone in Wall Street is a armchair monetary policy analyst.
Oh, yes.
But there are a lot of people who think that the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates once or twice or three times in the next year or so, maybe soon, maybe 12 months. And people didn't necessarily think that a year ago. So how does that all fit together from the perspective of someone who's sort of like on Wall Street? You've got a job, you're allocating capital, maybe you've got clients, you're putting them in this or that, or, you're shifting from one sector to the other. Those two things, the sort of where tax rate's going to be in a year and where interest rate's going to be in a year. How do you look at that?
Okay, and I would put one other thing, if I could, Richard, which is we're talking about growth and investment and so on and so forth. I'd also be looking at regulation, and of which antitrust is part of that. And Wayne Cruz and your team at CEI do terrific work, and I've been very pleased to write to publish stuff which you guys have written, and look forward to publishing much more. Wayne had something in the other day with us. Deregulation was something that the Trump administration achieved to a degree. I think if he was re-elected, we would see that again, probably. No, more than probably, actually. The regulation is an enormous burden, and unfortunately, it's hot-wired. There were heroic exceptions. Jimmy Carter did some deregulations of the airlines and things like that, and good for him. So I think regulation, environmental regulation, is going to be an enormous drag on growth in the next few years. I think the outgrowths of environmental regulation, which is cutting back on this country's natural energy resources is going to hold back growth. Taxes, if they do increase the corporate tax, which it's sort of mid-table. I mean, the US, particularly once you throw in state taxes, there's no great corporate tax giveaway. Corporate tax is reasonably high in this country. Of course, there are people who can play funny games and so on and so forth, but that's not typically how it works. And we have to remember who ultimately pays corporate taxes, because people don't seem to understand. I know you understand this, Richard, but the person who really pays the corporate tax is the employee, and the consumer and the shareholder. It's not those wicked old top-hatted people in the C-suites. So I think that if we see tax increases, that will depress growth. If you see tax increases on Americans generally, that's not going to be particularly great for growth. And when people say to me, "Well, Andrew, well, look back at the early 1960s," and you sometimes see this, hear this, and there was even one moment in Mad Men, a show I rather enjoyed, which was making that political point. But marginal tax rates were much, much, much higher in the early 1960s for people at the very top. Well, they were, but there were so many exceptions that no one paid them. So they are irrelevant from the point of view of the discussion. If you want to see what can happen with dramatic cuts in tax rates in terms of growth, you need to look to the Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge tax cuts of the 1920s. Warren Harding, I'm a great Silent Cal fan. Let's hear it for Warren Harding. Sort of reputation was a little bit blemished, but he was good on the taxes. And you look at JFK's tax cuts, and then you look at Ronald Reagan's tax cuts. And I don't think we're going to be looking at that. Now, one reason, other than ideology, that we're not going to be looking at that, because the government we now expect to do much more than it did in the 1920s, or the early 1960s. And we don't really have a revenue problem in one sense, in the tax as a share of GDP is not out of line historically, but our spending is way out of line. Mm-hmm. And this comes to your other question, which is about interest rates. At the beginning of the year, to correct you politely, people did think that we would have had interest rate cuts by now. I think Powell actually has realized the problems were more tough than many thought. He has also remained praiseworthily ignoring the electoral cycle. And some Fed chairmen are better at that than others. Volcker was another one who was very good. If you ever read his autobiography, there's a very amusing anecdote about that. 3% inflation, which is roughly where we are now, is actually quite high. And if you read Volcker's autobiography, I am getting no commission for mentioning it. He actually considered, I mean, he knew he'd done well, but he left and the inflation was about 4%. And he thought that was terribly high. And he writes in the book, why on earth would you target 2% inflation? Look what 2% does compounded over 25 years. So, but let's accept that 2%, we get down to 2%. I have my doubts whether we will, but I think that there is a lot of pressure now to cutting rates. There are signs, I mean, despite the recent good GDP numbers, there are some signs here and there of weakness. We have a monstrous problem, I still think, with office property. So I can see rates coming down a bit. Stock prices are, as a rule of thumb, the flip side of that. Rates go down, stocks go up, although it's not always the case. However, if we look at interest rates, we have to be thinking of three exogenous factors. I think that's the right word. The first is the world is a rough place and it's getting rougher. And I don't think that we will be able to avoid quite a major, and we have, of course, vast debt, as we all know. I don't think we're going to be able to avoid more military spending. I think it's going to be hard. We also have the $3 trillion. Now, that's not all being spent in the US, but the cost of the green transition, if you call it that, is going to push interest rates up. Ken Rogoff wrote an article about this in the FT last year, I think. The ECB have admitted, the European Central Bank have admitted it absolutely, and I think also inflation is going to be kept up because energy prices, your utility bills are going to go higher. So I think that we are looking the demand of capital from the green transition, plus other costs imposed by the green transition, plus defense expenditure, are already long-term factors saying that we're going to have higher interest rates. And the other one is the deficit. There's a phrase, gray rhino. Are you familiar with the phrase gray rhino?
Yeah.
Well, you have the black swan,
Yeah.
which is this unexpected thing and blah blah blah. The gray rhino, and I must get her name as Michelle Walker, I think is the name. It's a great, just Google it. It's a marvelous phrase which she thought up. I've written about it a little bit. It's a sort of thing that everyone knows is coming, but don't do anything about. And the gray rhino is our debt, and that is going to. I mean, we are very, very lucky in the US in that everyone wants the dollar. And one of the things that when you read about a crisis, as an investor, one of the things that you learn is that even if the crisis is in the US, you can actually see foreign money pouring into the US as the safe haven. You've seen that historically repeatedly, because it's the dollar. And when Liz Truss did her, who was British Prime Minister for a couple of months, did her quite well-intentioned in some ways, go for growth and a more deregulatory approach and a more liberal approach. She did so without properly thinking through the debt. And I spoke to a Thatcherite minister at the time, who'd been in the old days, and he said, "No, I appreciate what he's trying to do, but she forgets that when we did our stuff." He said, "It's not like you." He's obviously British. It's not like you Americans. And he laughed. He said, "We don't have the dollar. We have the pound, and we had to get our debt down. We could shift the tax burden, which they did, from direct to indirect taxation. We couldn't reduce the actual amount until we got the debt down. And the US has much more freedom of maneuver, as he said to me, and it does. But the fact is, the greater the debt burden grows, that will creep into the price of the cost of money, not least because there's more of that money is being needed, and the alternative is money printing, and we don't want to go down that route any more than we have done. We've gone down far too far down that route anyway. So that is going to push up interest rates, and that then leads to the question, well, what are we going to do about the debt? And I get asked this the whole time. I bet you do too. If I can mention another great think tank, which is the Manhattan Institute. Mm-hmm. If I want to feel sad, and he's written for us a few times, I'm always grateful. And I always say, let's make the readers sad, which he always succeeds in doing. Is Brian Riedel, and what his thesis is, and I would counsel looking at it. I'm sure you have done it, and your colleagues have done. Is that if you look at the Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and all the rest of it, there's going to be a crunch. The expectations of how this is going to be financed were based on, if you look at the CBO reports from a few years ago, were based on long-term interest rates of 3%, which were absolutely insane, as Brian pointed out. People like Jim Grant pointed out that if you looked at the rates 2010 in the 2010s on his calculations, there is argument behind it. He said they were at 4,000-year lows, which was a reason to think that they might perhaps adjust up again. So you've got all these demands on money, And like any commodity, where there's more demand and a limited supply, unless you start turning on the printing presses, the cost of that good, which is money, will rise. So I think that we are looking, it's going to go up and down in the next year or so, who knows? But if you ask me to look at it on a 5-year view, I'd say we were looking at higher interest rates rather than lower. And that will hold back, is another factor that will hold back growth. What are we going to do about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? My hard-faced Manchester Liberal colleague, Dominic, was sharpening, he's borrowing Javier Millet's chainsaw as we speak. But the reality is, political reality, I think nothing will happen in that respect unless until the crisis is staring us straight in the face.
Right.
And I've been working a lot about what Millet has been doing and the mess Argentina is in, and you can see that there. What we should hope from governments economically, whether they are Democratic or Republican, is that they should not be piling on extra unfunded liabilities. And when I look at both parties, I see, should we say, I'll put this very politely, I see grounds for concern, but I see more grounds for concern with the Democrats rather than the Republicans. Although I would say that any idea that we can sort of get rid of or substantially reduce the income tax by moving it over to tariffs is divorced from reality, in that the last time I looked, the first two dates in the calendar for this year were 2-0 rather than 1-8. And you're just not going to, regardless of the other damaging effects that you would get, you're not going to be able to finance this through tariffs. And what I hope is that if we get a Republican government or administration and substantial control of Congress, is the very least they might do is avoid piling on extra unfunded mandates. Because the problem that we have is with, and Brian makes this point repeatedly, Dominic makes this point repeatedly, the problem we have is not so much the discretionary spending, but the stuff that just kicks in, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and but we don't need to be making the problem worse. And
Right.
in a lot of respects, we have been doing so.
Yeah, the sort of, you know, explosive growth projected for entitlement spending is ultimately the albatross around our neck in terms of fiscal discipline in the United States. And I mean, I agree with you on a couple angles here. One, that the the incentive structure that got us here is not going to evaporate overnight. Therefore, we're not going to. It's not reasonable to expect um, uh, a massive rejiggering of the way we tax and spend in this country in advance of a real crisis point. So perhaps we could ask, as you suggested, whoever's in power in the future to take this sort of Hippocratic oath, at least first do no harm, right? If you're
Yeah,
if you're not going to solve the problem, at least don't create massive new entitlement spending. But then getting to the point where we've had these fiscal cliff negotiations in Congress before, where with the debt limit, where we were, you know, 24 hours away from defaulting on payments, but Congress fixed it at the last second with the sort of stopgap measure in terms of approving a higher debt limit, or more spending in the temporary over a temporary span of time, that that members of Congress can be expected to do something constructive when they have absolutely no other choice.
yeah.
And so it's the phrase that I think is sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill. I think is, you can trust the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried absolutely everything else. Um, so I don't think I'm certainly not a doomer in
No,
terms of economic policy, and that I think everything is just going to completely fall apart and Americans are going to become Zimbabwe or Venezuela or that. But there's going to have the heat is going to have to be pretty close to their face before members of Congress decide to actually vote for something which may not be entirely popular, but which will at that point have become absolutely necessary in terms of fiscal discipline.
And I think that we have to remember two things. Firstly, that the other thing that we should not get ourselves into despair. And this is not the late period Soviet Union. I should actually write an article about this at some point. I was at some talk the other day talking to a bunch of people, and someone said, "Well, don't you have anything cheerful to say?" And Dominic said, "Oh, Andrew doesn't really do cheerful." And then he gave some cheerful things, and he was, of course, was quite right. And I'm old enough to have watched Apollo 11 as a small boy. My parents, selfishly, the Americans did not accommodate British TV viewers with the landing. And so it was very late if you were 11 years old, but I was allowed up late to watch it. It was a formative, a great memory. And I look at SpaceX and I think, my God, the entrepreneurial activity of the US is astounding. This is, I mean, the old golden goose has been incredibly poorly treated, but the innovation that we see here is still above us. The EU is so bloody hopeless that they now describe themselves as a regulatory superpower. I mean, if there is any more greater admission of failure, I don't know what it is. Well, we can't make anything, but we'll regulate it and try and screw it up for everyone else, specifically the Americans. So I think the optimism about and for investors, there's always something. My clients would always say to me, there's always something somewhere to invest in, but that will continue to be the case. And I think that this country is still going to be one of the best bets that there is on a longer term view. But that doesn't mean we should allow ourselves to be complacent. And what we can do, the don't do no harm point is absolutely right. And if only people would say dollar in, dollar out, or I think they did this in the Trump administration. I think at one point it was regulation in, two regulations out.
Yes.
Which is exactly the way to go. I'd actually like to see sunset clauses on just about all regulations, many laws for that matter as well. But I think what you can do is, because a lot of people say, well, just mean test Social Security and at least and Medicare or some of the Medicare programs. And I understand the logic of that, and it may be where we have to go, broadest backs and all that. But we should remember that means testing is a form of tax. And we had this debate in Britain in the 1980s. And Mrs. Thatcher always rejected it. And she said, no, I don't think that we should penalize people towards the end of their lives who have savings, who have worked hard. She said, this is sending an absolutely terrible message. We have to do this some other way. And that, it was easier times in a way. What you can do is a lot of rather technical adjustments that you would, for example, what she did is she changed the basis on which you adjusted the pension, the cost of living adjustment. And I think, I'm trying to remember which way around it was. It was either tied to the average wage or the CPI. I think it was tied to the average wage, and she changed it to the CPI, or maybe the other way around. I forgot. That saved billions. I think you encourage private savings. One of the things I have on my to-do list, I met him the other day, is the former Chilean pension, the architect of Chile's essentially private pension system. And basically, as I understand it, and this is based on hearing him speak at a talk and reading a little bit about this, for people below a certain age, and this scheme has now been going for many, many years, you sort of have your own personal 401k with the government. but it is yours. And what that also does is it creates a constituency that says you're not going to touch that. And the Chileans made this very clear. Chilean workers, so they did not expect. No, this is ours. Go away. You can't touch it. And I think that we will have to do things like we're looking at changing the basis of Social Security, of contributions. And it's not going to be easy because you've got all, it's too late for me. Compound interest doesn't work so well as I hurtle towards the grave. But younger people should be able to start building up sort of their own pensions with lots of help. So I think that there are things that can be done. The other thing I would do, and here at this point, the ghost of William Buckley throws me angrily out of the window. You probably throw me angry out of the window through the wires. This is not mathematically the answer, but it would help. I would introduce, because I prefer consumption taxes to income taxes. And unfortunately, the clean switch, which I would prefer, is not going to happen. You're not going to get rid of income tax. But what happened in Britain in the 80s was income taxes, the marginal rate dropped very, very sharply. It was 83%. And within about 6 or 7 years, it was down to 40. But indirect taxes went up quite sharply. And I think that I think Kevin Williamson agrees with me about this. I think he and I are the two heretics on this one. But he may have changed his view. But the point about that, obviously, is it encourages savings, and you want people to work harder, to be rewarded, and I'd rather people encouraged to work than to spend. And you can, by the way, yes, of course, it's regressive by definition, but you can ease it considerably by sparing all sorts of things from indirect taxation. Children's clothes, for example.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with the interview we had on the show a few weeks ago with Scott Hodge at the Tax Foundation. We talked about possibly some of these big picture tax reform changes going forward, moving so sort of, again, the incentive structure so that we are pro-growth and we don't penalize savings and investment. Well, Andrew, this has been an excellent, fascinating, wide-ranging discussion here, and I think maybe you have left. We were a couple of minutes ago. We were talking about whether you're optimistic or not, and I think maybe you were sort of hand in hand with my good friend, colleague on our founder here at CEI, Fred L. Smith Jr., who frequently described himself as a despairing optimist.
I like that. That's sort of what I am. Yeah, I like that.
He was aware of all the problems we have, but still optimistic anyway. So thank you so much for being with us. Before we go, yeah, where should everyone find you online? I assume nationalreview.com.
Yeah, nationalreview.com, or you can go to I think it's nrcapitalmatters.com as well. People sometimes tell me, I think it's because they're deeply ashamed of our free market fundamentalism. I joke, Rich, in case you're listening. And we're on the main screen. We're at the bottom right. So if you just go to National Review website, go down to the sort of the bottom right, there we are. And there's always something new up Monday through Friday. But otherwise, I think it's nrcapitalmatters.com. We'll get you there as well. And we're easy to contact. I'm on Twitter at A Stuttaford, and love hearing feedback. And some of my colleagues don't read the comments. I always read the comments, and it can be painful, but you do learn a lot.
All right, excellent. Thanks again for being with us, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you.